Great, we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Product School Talk. As always, I have an awesome guest for you. Just for those of you who don't know, we teach product management courses, coding and data at our 6 campuses, and we also host weekly events there as well. You can learn more about us at productschool.com. And our guest today is Courtney Cacavo. I just make sure I say that right. She's a product manager at Intuit, and she's here with us today. Hi, Courtney. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're happy to have you here. Can we start by talking a little bit about how you broke into product management?
Sure. So my background is really actually on the consumer psychology side. So I did both an undergraduate and master's degree in psychology, and I did some research around consumer psychology and how people understand how people interpret brands and how that affects their willingness to pay and their adoption. And from there, I sort of got interested in customer research. And so I did a internship at a startup doing customer research and really loved it, and moved from there into product management.
Awesome. Cool. That's really interesting way you got started. Cool.
Yeah.
So I know you have a presentation for us today on customer research. So while you share your screen, I'm just going to do a couple of things here. So guys, just so you know, you can type in your questions in the chat box. So we're going to do Q&A following her presentation, and we'll take those. So just give you a couple minutes or a couple seconds to, to get that set up. And it looks like we're good. Awesome. And then I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how I approach customer research and how that fits into my product development cycle, but happy to take any questions and excited to hear what you guys take away and what you guys want to know more about. So to give you a little background, as Cassandra mentioned, I'm a senior product manager at Intuit, and I really work on our accounting software. So it's called QuickBooks, and it's specifically for self-employed customers. Before that, I've managed products at a number of very different, but also large startups across healthcare, finance, social networking, and travel. And really across all those different experiences, I've learned a ton about how people experience products from the different customer research projects that I've done. And so today I want to talk a little bit about how you best can use customer research, and really how you can use that most effectively within the product development process. So my approach, I weave customer research into my product development cycle at sort of 3 very key points. First, in understanding, just generally what the customer needs are. Then once we have an understanding of customer needs, coming up with a solution and actually validating that with customers. And then finally, validating the actual execution of that solution. And so my product development cycle usually starts by first identifying what that business goal is that we're trying to achieve. So something like, how do we acquire new users, or how do we reduce churn? And then we take that business problem and figure out how to sort of marry the unmet customer needs that we've observed with that. And so we'll go ahead and develop our own hypotheses around what those customer needs might be, and we'll actually do a round of customer research to investigate those needs. And then once we have a really good grasp on what that highest impact customer problem is, I'll then work with my team to come up with a solution that we believe will actually meet the customer need and also simultaneously meet that business goal. Then at that point, we do a round of customer research once we've got that solution, and we'll validate that solution, and we'll go through a process of continuous iteration to refine those ideas. Then once we feel really, really solid about the solution that we've got in place, we'll do a final round of customer research to make sure that the execution of that is right. And so here we'll do some kind of usability testing. Then once we launch the solution, I typically approach it as a split test so that we can actually measure that impact in a very quantifiable way. So I'm gonna chat a bunch about how I think customer research is just the greatest thing ever, but I'd be remiss if I didn't really call out a very important caveat, which is that absolutely customer research is a super invaluable tool, but at the end of the day, it's one tool out of really just a bunch that a product manager should be using as part of their product development cycle. And so, just like any other tool, you have to understand when you should be using it and when it's really not as helpful. And so what I found is that customer research is really, really great when you're trying to identify customer segments. And so often you'll hear people talking about segmenting their customers by age or by gender. But what I found in my own experience is that oftentimes those segments are really not as useful as understanding what brought someone to your product and why they picked your product over others. So for example, when you're looking at social networking products, this is what I was doing a lot of when I worked at Meetup, saying 30 to 50-year-old women as one segment is not really as helpful because they may not have as much in common as people who move to a new town and people who don't know anyone in this new place, regardless of what their gender or age is. And so really one tool I like to use for this kind of segmentation is this jobs to be done framework. And so here the idea is that customers aren't they're not buying a product, they're hiring a product to do a job. And so really, at the end of the day, every customer has a job to be done, and they're really just looking to hire the best product to do that job. Christensen's canonical example of this is around, trying to understand how to improve a milkshake, which is a fun example. So he learned that there was actually this group of people who would go and buy milkshakes every morning on their way to work. And these people were really hiring the milkshake to keep them from getting bored on their commute to work and to keep them sated until lunch. And so what's cool about this framework is that it really shifts the emphasis from what your product can do to instead what customer need is being met. And it's a very, very subtle shift, but it's actually a very powerful one. And so when I'm investigating customer needs, I'll often start my research with questions about what it is that the customer is hiring us to do and what their job to be done is. And once I have that information, I'll then segment our customers along the lines of these jobs. So, obviously customer research is really great for understanding customer needs and for validating hypotheses, but there's definitely limitations in that it's not going to give you the definitive answer of whether someone will use your product and how they'll actually use it once it's in the wild and when no one's actually watching. And so, we typically do a handful of customer interviews. And so, you can do 5, 10, you can even do 20 customer interviews, but really no matter what you learn, that N is going to be super small. And so, yes, it can give you confidence that you're headed in the right direction, but you're not going to be able to draw these very concrete conclusions about whether something will move your metrics or not. And so for that, you'll really want a quantitative method like split testing to get that definitive answer. And also the other important caveat is that customer research generally happens in a somewhat forced environment. And so, when you're checking your email, you don't normally talk out loud about what you're thinking and what you're reading. And so split testing is actually really great as a complement there for putting something into the wild and actually having customers interact with it on their own terms. And so you get sort of a very different perspective from the customer research and the more quantitative measurement methods like split testing. And I will say, split testing has its own drawbacks. And so here are the lessons that you learn from an A/B test are generally pretty limited to that very specific implementation. And so we don't necessarily understand why something doesn't perform well. And that's really why you need both the quantitative and the qualitative research to complement each other. So I'm going to walk through sort of a juicy example from my time at Betterment. So when I was working there, I launched this feature called tax coordinated portfolios. And basically, we took this very fancy investing strategy called asset location. And this was something that financial advisors would use with their super rich clients. And it was really sort of exposed to a small set of premier clients, but we actually took it and built out our own version of it, much more advanced technology-based version, and we offered it to all of our customers. in a nutshell, asset location is a way of looking at your assets and really optimizing where you hold those assets in order to minimize your investment taxes. And so, you don't necessarily need to understand the ins and outs of it, but if you basically think of it as free lunch, that's a pretty good way of thinking of it. And so for us, this was actually a really, really big deal, because while these human advisors would use these simple heuristics to figure out what to do maybe once or twice a quarter, we were using thousands of calculations every single day to figure out how to optimize your investments. So it was a pretty huge improvement over the existing system. And so this project really started out because the trading team had come up with this idea, and they'd worked out this very impressively robust algorithm. And they came to my team to figure out how to build out a customer experience around it. And so we started doing a ton of interviews with our customers to see just, at a high level what they understood about asset location. And as you can probably all imagine, no one really had any idea what asset location was. And this was kind of just really, that was, interesting in and of itself. But what was really amazing was just like people didn't have any idea that they were actually paying taxes on their investments. And so we had built this just incredible solution to a problem that no one had any idea that they had. And so coming away from that research, we knew we were going to have a really big challenge of figuring out how to educate people about this thing. And so as we were building out the flow so that customers could actually enable this feature, I was figuring out how we could try to sort of explain this to customers. And so I put together this very simple deck with a couple of very amateur illustrations, and we would use that as the beginning of each customer interview. And so the deck really just walked customers through how dividend taxes work at a very high level, and then also what we were doing behind the scenes in order to optimize those taxes. And so we would talk about stuff like, holding your tax inefficient stuff in your tax advantaged accounts and putting your tax efficient stuff in taxable accounts. And, we'd show customers that deck, and it would, serve as a substitute for whatever that product marketing would end up being. And then we would actually take them into the flow to set up their tax coordinated portfolio, and people would seem to sort of get it and they'd be okay. But then a few slides in, they'd start to get super confused, or they think that they'd actually understood the deck, but then when it actually came to setting it up in the flow, they'd suddenly realize they had no idea what they were doing. And so one guy even said, "I feel flayed," which, whatever you do as a product manager, you do not want your customer to feel flayed. So that was not a great, promising experience there. And so, with a little bit of guidance from us, they'd eventually make their way through the flow, but they never really felt great about it. And they would ask about how they could turn it off, or they'd say, they weren't really sure if they would end up setting it up on their own, which is absolutely crazy because, as I mentioned before, this feature was literally free money. So we knew that we were doing something wrong and really missing the mark. And so then we thought, okay, well, what if we don't even explain it? How little can we actually tell someone to have them still feel comfortable enough to turn this thing on? And so we updated our deck, and instead of focusing on the benefits of setting this feature up, we focused on the benefits of turning this thing on, rather than focusing on the mechanics of what was happening. And we showed them very, very concretely how much extra money that would end up in their pocket by setting this up. And then, sort of to complement that, we put together this quick calculator that actually allowed them to enter their information so they could see what impact this feature would have on their own accounts. And really just across the board, this was an infinitely better experience for customers. Of course, there were still a couple of customers who wanted more information, but overwhelmingly they felt just way better about the experience. And coming away from it, they told us they would actually use it. And so we heard customers say something like, this gives me a better feel for what's happening. It gives me more comfort. And so the interesting question here is, why was there this difference? Well, as I'm sure you can all imagine, investing can be very complicated, and most of our customers were really coming to us because they wanted us to deal with that complexity for them. And really, they just wanted to know that they were making the right decision about where they put their money. We had spent the time to explain the mechanics. They got super bogged down in that complexity. Here they were sitting down to just check in on their account, and suddenly they're learning a ton about dividend taxes, which for most people is not really a great way to spend their time. And so we actually found that like a lot of these people didn't have that background to even understand that complexity. So it wasn't even just confusing them, it was actually making them feel bad about themselves. But really, on the other hand, when we focused the experience around the returns, they felt super confident that they were making the right decision, even if they couldn't actually articulate what exactly was happening behind the scenes. And so for us, that was a really big lesson learned that, sometimes the customer just doesn't need to understand how the sausage is made. So just, to quickly summarize what we've talked through, as PMs, we're not always going to be right, and user research is super, super important to help really inform and validate our product decisions. And some companies are really great and have this really strong focus on user research. And Meetup, we had an awesome usability lab, and we had a dedicated researcher, and we'd bring in customers every day, and we would interview Meetup organizers, and we'd actually even have monthly lunches where they could come in and tell their whole story to the company. But some companies don't have that, and really at some companies I've had to be the one to bring that with me and start that discipline. And so, don't be afraid. It's not easy, and it's definitely a skill in itself to understand how to do it. But ultimately, talking to your customers and really understanding their needs will always, always help you and make sure that you're building something that actually matters and something that solves real customer problems. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's really important to use both quantitative and qualitative data because customer research is really great at understanding why something works or why it doesn't work, but you'll still really need that quantitative data to prove that something doesn't work. And the last thing to know is that really this is just all about learning. And so if you haven't done a lot of customer research before, that's okay. And really all it takes is just a sense of curiosity and a willingness to listen to your customers. And really just like anything else in life, the more you practice it, the better you become. So there's never a bad way of approaching it, and just sort of jumping in is a great way to start. So that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The presentation is really interesting concept too. Somebody actually loved, a few people loved the quote, "The user doesn't need to understand how the sausage was made," which is a really good point. So we have quite a few questions coming in already. You guys are more than welcome to start typing in some more. I'm going to start with one here from Mago. Would love to hear about timing around this process. Including both how much time do you dedicate to research and testing, how long does it take to implement new solutions, and how quickly are you iterating? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'll be perfectly honest, it's varied a bunch depending on the company, and so also depending on the project. And so what I found is that startups tend to be a lot faster with these processes. And my personal philosophy with a lot of this is it's better to get something out the door and start learning rather than trying to come up with the perfect solution and waiting for that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So in terms of like actually putting stuff in front of customers, a lot of times there isn't really a clear boundary in terms of iterating and reviewing stuff with customers. So what on some projects like the tax coordinator portfolio project, we actually would show customers something, and then at the end of the day we would sort of synthesize what we've learned from those customers, change it on the spot, and then start the next day with new customers and sort of getting their feedback. And so sometimes you can actually be super iterative and sort of blend the lines between the development and the research. And so those timelines can be very different depending on how big the project is and what you're learning. But I don't think there's necessarily like a great way to approach it, as long as you're learning from customers and you're taking those insights back to the product and able to sort of improve the product. I don't think there's necessarily a hard and fast timeline that anyone should be sticking to.
Okay. Awesome. I'm going to pull the first question that came through. This was actually from Daniel. He said, "Hey, I'm working with a learning platform that's already put out an MVP. Should I be asking for feedback on the existing app, doing research to understand the deeper customer needs, or a combo of both?
Yeah. So if you have an existing product out there, definitely really great to do customer research on that product and understand where it's really just nailing the customer experience and where it's failing them. And so if you don't have a great sense of what problem that existing product is solving, that's absolutely something that you, I would say you should focus on, because if you ever want to improve on that product, you really need to understand what the customer problem is to actually improve that experience. And so understanding just at a basic level what that customer need is, and also understanding what customers love about the existing product and not, and don't love, is really helpful. And one of the things I like to do as well is I like to talk to people who use the product and people who don't use the product, and then also talk to people who started to use the product and didn't, because they can also all give you very different perspectives. And so some of the conversations I have aren't even about the product that I'm developing, but actually understanding the insights from other competitors. So if there's a solution that people are already using today, maybe it's not your product, maybe it's not even that category of product, maybe they're just doing it themselves with some other approach. And so understanding, sort of walking in your customer's shoes to understand how they're actually solving that customer problem today, whether it's in your product or outside of your product, and understanding where the pain points are will then help you a ton as you're thinking how to improve the existing experience, and how to launch something that's actually solving that customer need at the end of the day.
Right. Awesome. We have a few more coming in here. So let me see. I'm going to try to pull one. This one is from Ash K. Hi, Courtney. Very informative talk. How do you decide on what customer needs to focus on during the research?
Yeah. So sometimes I start with a very broad conversation, and it's just about, how did you decide to use this product, and why did you first come to us, and having that understanding of the customer's mindset when they first came to the product, or just understanding how, if they're not using your product, how they get that thing done.
Right.
So for us, it was around investing. So understanding what platforms people are using, and just understanding a little bit about the context that someone's coming to your product in is actually a really great place to start, even if you don't know what customer problems you want to focus on. And that high level conversation can usually highlight a couple of areas that are really important to the customer and where they're tripping up. And so you can even ask the customer, how they would prioritize those customer needs. And so, frame it as like, if there was one thing that you could do, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing, like what would that thing be? And that you can actually sort of engage the customer in helping you to prioritize those problems. And then sort of marry that data with what you're seeing from sort of a business standpoint, understanding like, as a product, where do we have the biggest opportunity to make a dent in that customer problem? And so maybe the most important problem for the customer is something that you can't really solve. And so, sort of marrying those two sides of like, as a business, what can we do? And, from the customer's perspective, what's important to them? And sort of when you have that holistic perspective, I think that makes it really easy to then figure out where should you be focusing your time.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it would make it a lot easier to prioritize for them. Here's, let's see. So this other one from Courtney. For complex products and domains that people are not usually comfortable with, how do you get customers to tell you what they even need? And how do you come up with features that could benefit users?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's interesting. So I've worked on a lot of products that are really complicated, like health insurance and investing. And what I've found is that a lot of the problems are really just sort of, especially when it comes to complex features, just sort of like very basic understanding. And so in my experience, a lot of the focus has been, how do we make something that's very complicated accessible to somebody? And so maybe it's not like developing a ton of really fancy features, but really just sort of understanding where the customer's understanding is and how they talk about that problem or that feature. And from that, you can usually gain a lot of insights around how you should be presenting that product to them, or how complex your features should be based off of what your customer understands. And so yeah, I think it's a really interesting, I think that's sort of my favorite part of being a product manager. I like working on the really complicated stuff, because a lot of times as somebody who's an expert in the area, you spend a lot of time thinking about like, oh, well, what if we did this and what if we did this? But if your customer doesn't even understand the landscape, then solving those problems isn't actually solving their problem. So
right. Oh, absolutely. Awesome. We have time for just a couple more questions. So I have another one here. This one's from Ling Ling. How does a product manager work with the user research team? And what if the findings of consumers are like different? Do you also work with customer support closely to get customer feedback? So,
yeah, this is a super great question. Something I probably should have called out. So some companies, we've had dedicated researchers that I've worked really closely with, and in those cases, it's been sort of a partnership. So I will come to them with here's this business goal we have, and here are some ideas of things that we want to understand, and then it's a partnership to actually figure out how we want to collect, who we want to talk to, and how we collect that data from the qualitative research. At some places, it's been myself doing this, and so there's been less of a partnership there, but user research is often done very differently at very different companies. So you sort of just have to figure out like who you have available and what their skill sets are. And as a product manager, I think a lot of the time we're sort of filling the void where it exists. And so, so you sort of have to work within the constraints you have. I completely forgot the second half of, oh, I remember now, sorry.
Okay.
The thing that's really interesting is that I talked a lot about sort of customer interviews and one-on-one conversations, but you can actually get a ton of these insights from working really closely with your customer experience or customer support team. And so I see this as sort of one channel of data, but there's also App Store reviews, there's feedback that's coming in through your customer experience team, and so there's lots of different ways to collect those insights, and I don't think that you should necessarily take any one channel in isolation. What I like to do is sort of do that customer research through one-on-one interviews, and then sort of triangulate that insight, based off of what we're hearing from other channels of customer feedback. And I like to work really, really closely with our Intuit, we call it customer care, but with the customer experience team, and make sure, sort of bounce those insights off of them, and make sure that they're sort of seeing the same thing on their side. And I'll even like go through emails, I'll read reviews, and so I like to sort of see firsthand how the different feedback we're getting compares across those different channels.
Right, excellent. Thanks for getting to all three of those. Awesome. So for the last question, I saw a couple people post this in there. If you could speak a little bit more about your experience, either at Intuit or in your career, on a couple of things that you've learned along the way.
Yeah. Just specifically around customer research, or just sort of in general?
In general.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about product management is that it's a very different role depending on the company and the team. So there have been some companies that I've worked at where my experience as a product manager has been wildly different than people on my team, on the product management team within the same company. And so I think some of the really important things to think about as a product manager is figuring out how you can help move that team forward that you're working with the engineers, with the designers, like sort of flexing to be whatever they need. And always sort of bringing in that customer perspective, because I feel like it's very easy. A lot of companies hire PMs that are very strategic and have a background in business, and that's fantastic, and that's my background. But I think if you're missing that customer empathy and not sort of thinking everything through the lens of the customer, it's very easy to focus on building something that meets a business need but doesn't actually meet the customer need. And so I think there's really crucial skills around collaborating with your teammates and being whatever you need them to be, or whatever they need you to be, but then also, making sure that at the end of the day, you're the one who's the biggest customer advocate, and always, whatever you're working on at the end of the day, always thinking through everything through the lens of the customer and their needs.
That's really great advice. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to present today and answer a few questions, and it was great having you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Before we hang up, I would love to hear your final advice for aspiring product managers and those that want to break into the space.
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, and especially a lot from people who are trying to transition into product. And so my key piece of advice is that really the skills of a product manager are not super specific and super unique, that, really having that customer empathy, or that ability to look at data, or, think strategically about a business, those can be, skills that are shared across a bunch of different roles. And so if you have that skill, really just think of ways of, as you're trying to interview for roles, between what you've done and your experience, and show that, like, you may not have the title of a product manager, but you've done X, Y, and Z. And so it's not completely foreign to you. And honestly, I think the best way to really just have that experience is just to, find projects that you can work on, and ways that you can sort of exercise those skills, even if you haven't done them. And if there's something you want to do on the side, or if there's people that you can work with to get something out the door, like just having any experience, and any bridges that you can build when you're talking to someone about, like, hey, I've done this and it may not have been in that role. I think that's super, super helpful.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks.
And thanks everybody for joining us today. Lots of great questions. If you guys want more information about us, you can go to productschool.com, and you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter as well. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.